Rain came in sheets so thick it turned the world to sound. Hoofbeats vanished under the drum of water, and Sheriff Kane rode hunched in his black duster, brim low, the brim's edge spilling a constant river down to his collar. Lightning split the sky white and cruel. In that flash he saw his house on the rise, dark, silent, the porch glistening, and something darker smeared across the gatepost at the head of his yard. Blood. Another flash, closer, and the smear resolved into a handprint dragged downward, 5 streaks thinning into rainwater. Beyond it, the path to his door ran stippled with small, irregular stains, black in the wet, already half dissolved by the storm. He swung down from the saddle, boots sinking into sucking mud. The night smelled of wet sage and iron. His silver badge felt cold through the duster, a small moon pressed to his ribs. He touched it without looking, the way a man checks a wound, just to know it's still there. Then he drew the Colt .45 with the pearl grip and laid the flat of his free hand against the gate, feeling the vibration of the wind through the wood, as if the house itself were breathing. Another bolt burned the sky. In that jump-cut light, he saw more, prints on the path, one set smaller, dragging on the right side, another set not prints, but smudges, as if someone had been half carried and half pulled. Blood fanned where a body had stumbled. Blood dotted the low fence like black rain. Kane stepped forward, boots noiseless in the downpour. The blood trail climbed his stairs and stopped at his threshold. Not past it. At it, as if the man, or the ghost, had pressed a palm to the jamb and reconsidered stepping inside. A harder gust made the door creak against its latch. The Colt came up level. The sheriff's steel-gray eyes narrowed until the storm was just shapes and angles. The warped board at the hinge, the hairline crack in the panel where a winter freeze had split it 2 years back, the faint sway of the boot scraper. He listened. The rain's roar filled his skull, and underneath it, nothing. No lamp, hiss, no breath, no scrape of leather. Only thunder rolling off the hills and the wild patter of water hitting wood. He didn't call out. People who did that in stories got answers. In his life, calling only taught enemies where to aim. He eased the latch, nudged the door with the barrel. The room beyond lay dark as a closed eye. He could smell the smoke he'd banked in the stove that morning, now cold and damp. He could smell the old coffee in the pot, and the leather of his chair, and the ghost of whiskey in a glass he hadn't washed. He could smell rain and blood, both. Lightning fired again and burned a scene into brief existence. The table with his son's carved wooden horse where he'd left it on purpose all these years. The mantel with the family photograph turned face down. The clean swept floor. No figure in the corner. No shadow crouched beside the stove. He stepped inside, 1 pace, then 2. The rain on his hat brim became a steady ticking on the floorboards. Water dripped from his coat's hem into a growing puddle. He leaned his shoulder to the frame and waited, forcing his breath slow until it matched the storm's heartbeat. The Colt lived against his cheek, steady as a prayer. Silence answered back. Kane withdrew and swung the door half shut, leaving the storm to wash the threshold clean. The blood stopped here, but the night didn't. Somewhere beyond the porch, out near the black shape of his well, or the cottonwood that kept losing limbs in heavy winds, something had bled and then decided the sheriff's house was either sanctuary or trap. He holstered the Colt just long enough to hook his Winchester from the saddle. The rifle's oiled weight steadied his thoughts. He moved along the porch edge, staying within its curtain of rain. Lightning stitched the horizon, and for a split instant, the yard lay bright and stark, the wellhead shining like bone, the rope's bucket stuttering in the wind, the slick path where boots had skidded. He went toward the well. A soft sound reached him there at the corner of the house, a fragile thrum distinct from the storm, the wet catch of a breath strangled into quiet. He pressed to the wall, counted to 5, counted again, then slid around the corner low and fast, a rifle shouldered. Nothing moved. Only the bucket swayed on its chain, water slopping over its rim to vanish in the black mouth below. The stones around the well shone with rain, and something darker pooled between them, running toward the yard in thin rivulets. He knelt. The rain soaked his hat brim and pattered the back of his neck, cold as coins. He touched 2 fingers to the puddle and rubbed. His hand came away red, fresh. Whoever bled here hadn't bled out long enough to cool. A sound came again, ragged, behind the well wall, a man's breath trying to stay quiet and failing. Kane's jaw clenched. It would be so easy to aim over the stones and finish the question with a single answer. The badge against his ribs reminded him what the law said a man should do: call a doctor, send for deputies, secure the scene. The rain reminded him what the territory did with men who hesitated. He drew a longer breath and peered around the stones. Nothing but darkness and the smell of wet limestone. "Evening, Sheriff," said the storm in memory. The word wasn't out here, not now. It belonged to another night, another doorstep, another man, another wait. An hour earlier, he had ridden past the Gallows on the edge of dry water, where the wind thawed a wet creek from the rope, even in summer storms. The jailhouse lamp had shown him his own reflection in the window, stretched and distorted, a lawman's silhouette on a thin pane. He'd stood inside that jail before he rode, spinning the badge on a knuckle until it glittered and blurred. He had thought of his wife and his boy, and the day the world had narrowed to 2 gunshots and a smell of lie. He had told himself, again, that the badge was a promise and not a mask. A rancher's daughter had pressed a petition into his hand outside the general store. "Marshal Vane rides through tomorrow," she'd said, eyes hard. "Says he's cleaning up the county. Says your way is too soft." Maybe he's right, the shopkeeper had muttered behind her. Maybe it's time we saw Gallows earn their keep. Kane had not answered. He had met Vane's kind before. Shined boots, clean gloves, orders written in ink a shade darker than the truth. Men who made the law a cudgel because they preferred breaking to mending. He had saddled and ridden out in rain that turned the main street into a sheeted mirror, and he had felt the town's eyes in his back, like a row of notches on a stalk. By the time the ridge to his place had appeared beyond the cottonwoods, his jaw ached from the set of it. Now behind the well, something shifted. Not much. A weight settling. The sound a man makes when he wants to ask for help and thinks he might be shot for it. Kane eased the rifle aside and took out the Colt. "You move, you die," he said, the way a man tells the fire to stay in the stove. Calm, so it doesn't leap. No answer. He slid his left hand along the well stone, fingertips crawling over lichen and wet grit, and found the lip. With his right arm extended and the Colt steady, he rose into a slow stand, eyes level with the rim. Lightning walked across the low clouds, and for an instant he saw him. A man wedged between the well and the ground, back to the stone, one knee drawn up, one leg crooked wrong, a strip of cloth knotted tight above his thigh, where blood had soaked through and turned the knot black. Rain had plastered his hair to his skull. His face was young and old at once, too thin, too cut by wind. In the moment's hard light, the eyes were open and bright, with the sort of fever that eats a man's sense and leaves only his need. Then the night collapsed again, and the world was blind. "I'm fixin' to haul you out," Kane said. "You try steal on me, and I'll put you back in the ground you're wishin' for. You understand?" A pause. A swallow. Water. Hell. The sheriff slid his Colt back and got both hands under the stranger's armpits. The body was heavier than it looked and slack in ways that told the truth. He lifted, and the man's left boot skated on the stone and knocked the bucket so it clanged. The sound went down the well and came back thin and far away, like a church bell for the dead. They collapsed together in the mud. The man hissed and clutched at his thigh. Kane's hands came away slick. Lightning burned again, and that was when Kane saw the thing he'd missed. The faint mark on the stranger's wrist, half washed by rain. Not a brand, not a tattoo. A line of pale skin shaped by something that had rubbed it raw for weeks. Shackles. The sight sent heat up Kane's spine, as if someone had shoved a coal in under the scar that ran from his jaw to his neck. Men who wore chains were either criminals or victims, and too often the difference depended on who wrote the charge. The law said, "Take him in." The rain said he'd be dead by morning if left to it. "Hold," Kane muttered, voice low, and shrugged out of his soaked duster. He wadded it under the man's head and looked toward the house, the lamp, the stove, the clean table where the doctor might sew a wound while thunder counted seconds. A splash of light rolled over the yard. Lightning's brother, slower, dirtier. A lantern, far off on the road, bobbing in the rain like a will-o'-the-wisp. Another answered it. Then another higher on the ridge. Kane's mouth flattened. Deputies? Neighbors? Or the marshal, a day early, with his badge and his paper and his rope. The man on the ground coughed once, a broken sound, and found Kane's sleeve with a weak hand. His fingers pinched and slid in the wet cloth. He dragged the sheriff closer, breath warm and blood metal on Kane's knuckles. "Say it," Kane ordered, impatient at the sudden surge of lanterns and his own rising choices. The man's lips moved. Rain ticked on his teeth. "Jesse," he whispered, the name thin as a thread. "Your boy." Kane's heart missed its step. The stranger's head lolled, the eyes rolling white, and the lanterns on the ridge swayed closer through the rain. Kane hauled the man by his armpits, boots plowing 2 furrows through the soupy yard, every breath a wet rasp against the storm. The porch boards rang under their weight. He shoulder-bumped the door, kicked it shut with his heel, and the house swallowed the rain like a held breath. He slid the stranger to the table, swept aside the cold coffee cup and the turned-down family photograph with the back of his forearm, and cut the soaked trouser leg with his knife. Lightning bloomed in the window, and the wound leapt into view, ragged channel high in the thigh, torn and smoked at the edges, close shot. Powder burns, the kind that left spoke smell and black freckles on skin. The man's face had the gray-glazed look of a candle guttering. Blood streamed between Kane's fingers, warm as bath water. "Stay with me," Kane said, voice flat to cut through the man's panic. "What's your name?" The stranger blinked slow. Water tapped a steady metronome off Kane's hat brim onto the floor. "Eli," he breathed. "Eli Mercer." Kane tore a sheet into strips, cinched a tourniquet above the wound, and reached for the whiskey. He held the bottle to Eli's mouth. "Sip. Don't drown yourself." Eli drank, coughed, drank again. His teeth chattered when the bottle left his lips. Kane struck a sulfur match with his thumbnail, and the room jumped into gold, stove door yawning, lamplight trembling across old wood. The silver badge set on the table like a little moon. Kane let it spin once on its edge, while the needle boiled in the kettle. He didn't look at the face-down photograph he'd brushed to the floor, but memory didn't need eyes. Jesse's hair caught in cowlicks, a smear of molasses at the corner of his mouth, a fire that stole the air from every room in a man's life. "Hold," Kane said. He poured whiskey over the wound. Eli bucked like a fish on a gaff. Kane pinned him with a forearm and worked the needle, fast and mean, the way a man pulled a thorn from a horse. Outside, thunder rolled the hills. Inside, thread slid through flesh with a wet hiss. The room smelled of iron and corn liquor and old ash. "You been chained," Kane said quietly, nodding at the pale rubbed ring around Eli's wrist when the lamp wobbled. "Long time." Eli's laugh cracked. "Marshals' hospitality." "Whose?" Eli's eyes flicked, unfocused. "Vane," he whispered. "Luther Vane." The name clicked in Kane's head like a hammer falling. Clean boots, polished spurs, paper thick with proclamations. A badge that weighed heavier for all the empty space behind it. "Why's he want you dead?" Eli swallowed. The muscles in his jaw fluttered under stubble. "Because of what I carried. Because of who I ran from." Kane tied off the stitch and cut the thread with his teeth. "Speak." Eli's breathing sawed. He reached for the edge of the table and missed. Kane steadied his hand, felt the tremor running through him. Eli's fingers landed on the badge and pushed it back across the boards, like it burned. "The man who took your boy?" Eli said, voice thin. "Wore one of those." His eyes slid shut. "Jesse," he added, the name breaking. "He wasn't. Not at first." Kane's hand froze on the cloth. The storm grew teeth and gnawed at the windows. "You finish that." Eli sank into the darkness, breath skittering shallow as a trapped bird's. Kane stood very still, the house holding him like a box holds a fuse. He cleaned his hands on a rag that would never be clean again, then wrestled the stove to life till flame licked and crackled. He rolled Eli onto his side to keep the blood from drowning his lungs and packed the wound with cloth, tight but not cruel. The man's skin was hot as a skillet. Fever would be riding him soon. He pulled the curtain with 2 fingers and peered into the night. Lanterns moved on the ridge, a slow procession of yellow eyes. Not many. Enough. The rain softened, trading fury for persistence. Hooves sloshed down the road, patient as accountants. Somewhere out there, leather creaked and men hunched their collars against weather and consequence. Kane pinched the bridge of his nose, jaw working. The law said open the door when it knocked, yield custody to federal writ, fetch the dock, and wash the blood from your floor. Justice said something different, quieter and meaner. The man sleeping on his table held a key to a grave that had never closed tight. He poured coffee, black and old. He didn't drink it. Eli moaned and thrashed. Kane put a palm to his chest with the same pressure he'd used to calm a skittish colt. "Easy." "Cold," Eli muttered. "Storm'll pass." Kane tucked his own duster over the man, heavy with trail stink and wet dust. The gesture pulled at something behind his ribs he didn't care to name. Boots scuffed the porch boards. Kane's head turned. The sound arrived like a coin dropped on marble, small, exact, and expensive. Not a neighbor, not a cowhand. A man who expected doors to open. A knuckle rapped, 1, 2, 3, precise as drill. "Open up," a voice called. mild as milk. United States Marshal. Kane's teeth met with a quiet click. He uncocked the Winchester, set it behind the stove, and took the Colt from the table. He turned the lamp down until shadow brushed the ceiling. When he opened the door, rain smell walked in before the men. Marshal Luther Vane stood on the threshold with a wet hat brim and a smile you bought by the pound. He was middle height and too neat for the territory, mustache combed fine as horsehair, coat shedding water like a duck. Two deputies loomed behind him, lanterns painting their cheeks the color of old tallow. "Evenin', Sheriff." Vane tipped his hat a finger's breadth. "Speaking with you saves me asking the neighbors. I'm tracking a fugitive. Blood trail led to your gate. Lots of blood up country tonight," Kane said. "Storm rings it out." Vane's gaze slipped past Kane, into the dark, like a knife into a pocket. "Mind if we step in out the weather?" "I mind." Kane kept himself in the doorway, a man-height wedge. "You got paper?" Vane produced a folded sheet, crisp despite the rain. The sealing wax had bled, but the ink sat dry and definite, the kind that didn't wobble even when hands did. "Elias Mercer, wanted for murder and horse theft," Vane recited, voice sunny. "Dead or alive." Kane read without looking down, the way you read a man's face while he lies. "Who'd he kill?" "Man of good standing," Vane said. "Victim's name is a sorrow we don't need to share on a porch." "Funny thing about sorrow," Kane said. "It don't like being hidden." Vane's smile held. "Sheriff, I'd respect your office. I'd hate to think you were impeding federal business." Wind shouldered past them, fluttering the paper like a shot bird. Kane glanced at the pale welt around Eli's wrist again in his mind, at the powder-burned meat and the way the bullet had torn. Somebody had fired at near kissing distance. Somebody who wanted a story written a certain way. "Law says you can take him," Kane said, every word slow. "Law also says I can ask why your man's wrist looks like he's been chained to your stirrup for a month." A flicker in Vane's eyes, quick as a minnow. Bad men find themselves in all manner of difficulties. Kane let silence pool between them until the storm's mutter filled it. On the table behind him, the badge lay in the lamplight, like a coin on a gambler's palm. His finger wanted to set it spinning. He didn't. From the back room, Eli groaned a word that wasn't a word, raw and cracked. One of Vane's deputies shifted, and his slicker whispered. The marshal's head tilted like a hawk's. "You got hurt stock in there, Sheriff?" Kane's mouth cut a thin line. "I got my business." Vane's smile dropped a degree. "Mine too. Step aside. We'll bring him to the jailhouse and sort the rest." "The jail's dry," Kane said softly. He pictured brick, iron, keys stacked like promises. He pictured the gallows out by dry water, rope frayed by last winter's wind. He pictured a boy whose name still tasted like prayer. "Sheriff," Vane murmured, voice slipping sugar over iron, "I'm not asking twice." Kane let the Colt rise a hair. There was a time for preacher talk and a time for thunder. You just did. For a heartbeat, the night held still. Rain made coins in the yard. The deputy on the left shifted weight. The lantern in his fist swung and threw Vane's shadow long across Kane's floor, a black shape reaching for the table. "Reckon you remember the statute," Vane said, amusement ghosting back into his tone. "Harboring a fugitive, rope offense in some counties. Reckon you remember I could read before I could ride," Kane said. "You show me a judge with clean hands and I'll walk him to the jail myself." Vane's eyes cooled. "Clean is a matter of weather and opinion." "Justice ain't," Kane said. The words came out deep as a drum. Law ain't always justice, but justice rides with me. The two deputies' hands slid toward their irons like snakes finding holes. Vane's fingers hesitated at his belt and then chose his hat brim instead. He tipped it, polite as Sunday. "We'll camp yonder," he said, tilting his head toward the cottonwoods, "and return with daylight and witnesses. No trouble need be had where none is sought." Kane didn't move. "Bring a doctor." Vane almost chuckled. "For who?" "For the man you want hanging upright." Kane shut the door on the marshal's answer, and the latch clicked like a tiny coffin. The house breathed again. The storm rasped down to a steady whisper. Kane stood with his back to the wood and let his heart slow by force. He holstered the Colt, slid the Winchester closer to reach, and set another log in the stove. The flame took with a low, hungry sound. He poured more whiskey than a man should, and didn't drink that either. Eli stirred. Kane went to him. The man's skin shone with fever sweat, his hair pasted to his forehead in black strings. Kane laid a cool cloth there, and Eli's eyes opened a crack, glassy and bright. "You brought Vane," Eli said, breath like steam in winter. "He here?" "Not inside," Kane said. Eli's hand found Kane's sleeve with surprising strength. "Listen." The word scraped. "Your boy, he coughed. A harsh bark that bent him, and when it subsided his voice dropped to a broken whisper. "He didn't burn, not at first. He was taken by a star." Kane's throat went tight. "Say it plain." Eli's gaze slid to the badge, catching lamplight, and his mouth trembled in something like a smile. "Not his," he whispered, eyes drifting toward the door and the night beyond it. "Another, closer to you than any man." A horse snorted close. Porch boards murmured again. Then a new sound cut through the soft hiss of rain, metal sliding against leather, slow and careful, right outside the window. Kane lifted his head, every nerve tuning to the same note, and thought he saw the shape of a barrel easing past the glass. The lamp sputtered. The room seemed to lean. Someone towed the latch. The sound was a breath, hardly more. Kane's hand closed on the Colt before the thought finished forming. The door began to open. Dawn came up on grit and rain sheen, a pale ribbon across the basin. Sheriff Kane stood on his porch, boots wet, eyes on the muddy crescent where the stranger had collapsed in the night. The storm had washed most sign away, but not all. A stagger in the prints, a scuff where a man had fallen, the faint rake of a horse's shoe with a broken toe clip. Eastbound. He crouched, the silver badge in his fingers turning slow as a coin, feeling the old quiver of feral attention run along his nerves. Whoever hunted the wounded man had come close, close enough to smell the wood smoke of Kane's hearth. He found 3 brass shavings under the eaves where the stranger had leaned, shaved clean from a cartridge rim with a knife to make it feed. Clever or desperate, hard to say. Kane pocketed them and swung into the saddle. The roan blew steam into the chill. On the ridge, he halted, scanning the shallow valley until the light cut long enough to show him what the storm had meant to hide. A drag mark to the arroyo, and there, under a tangle of willow root, a strip of cloth printed with a blue rosette. Cavalry issue. Not new, not old, the kind that rode under men who thought a badge or a uniform excused everything they did in the dark. By the time he reached Doc Alder's, the boardwalk was drying to salt white. Doc met him at the door with whiskey breath and vinegar hands, eyes already flinty. "Bullet missed the lung," he said, jerking his chin toward the cot. The stranger slept slack-mouthed, bandaged from ribs to shoulder, grit still in his hair. Took it close. Powder burns. He'll keep if trouble don't find him first. Trouble already has, Kane said, showing the rosette cloth and the brass moons. Doc pinched the shavings, sniffed them as if they might speak. Military brass, he sighed. Territorial marshals' men use the same stock these days. Cheaper contracts. You thinking what I'm thinking? Kane's jaw set. I'm thinking Asa Pike never learned to leave my doorstep alone. The name hung like a fly over Sugar. Deputy Marshal Asa Pike, once a lean-boned saddle partner who'd slapped Kane's back when the badge was new, and the world still had edges he trusted. Later, the man who'd arrived too late, the night the house went to smoke and fire, who'd clapped Kane's shoulder in the cemetery and promised vengeance with a thin, priestly smile. Pike's shadow had crossed too many trails since. Law comes in asking, Doc said. What do you do? Kane watched the stranger breathe. Slow, shallow. A scar showed at his throat. An old rope burn paled to parchment. I lock him up, he said. Doc blinked. Jail him? Safest place in this town is behind my iron. Nobody breaks a man out of my cells without showing me their soul. Besides, Kane touched the stranger's wrist, counting. If he's bait, better he be bait I can see. They moved him at first light, half carry, half drag, Kane's duster thrown like a shroud over the man's shoulders. The jailhouse door gave with its familiar groan. Old pine, old ghosts. He settled the stranger on the bunk in cell 2 and slid the bolt, the click ringing clean. On the pegboard by the desk, the keys winked like little moons. The badge spun between Kane's fingers, bright, cold. Much obliged, the stranger whispered, not fully awake, his voice rough as gravel. Keep your thanks, Kane said. Save your breath. He poured water, held it to cracked lips, felt the tremor of fear and the salt of sweat, the aliveness of a man too near the other side. He was turning to the ledger when the street spoke. The shuffle of feet, the squeak slap of a leather latigo, boot heels that meant business. Kane's hand went to the Colt. The door swung open. 3 men in dust-stiff coats blocked the light. The one in the middle had a hat brim razored straight. A smile, thin as a cut. Rafe Delano, bounty rider, known for bringing men in breathing when it paid, and silent when it didn't. An iron star glinted at his lapel, not a badge exactly, but a tin the hired hands of Pike's office wore like a blessing. Morning, Sheriff, Delano said, eyes flicking to the cells. Here you got a stray needs fetching. This is a jail, not a corral, Kane answered. If the marshal wants a prisoner, he asks. He's asking, Delano said, producing a folded paper. Territorial seal in cheap ink. Warrant for one Jonah Vale on charges of murder, assault, and the theft of army stores. The name meant nothing to Kane. The timing meant everything. You boys can stand in the hall and admire my paint, Kane said, or step outside and admire the weather. Either way, you don't step through that door today. He pointed at the threshold with the tip of the Colt. Not one boot sole. Delano's smile didn't change, but his eyes cooled. You making this about pride? Or something more tender? Law, Kane said. Not a word you pronounce real well. Delano's left hand grazed the butt of his revolver like a lover's cheek. Ain't no law if the badge won't obey a warrant. Kane's badge spun, the metal whispering against his thumb. Law ain't always justice. He didn't say it out loud, not yet. Rain ticked from the porch eave. In the back cell, the stranger shifted and groaned. The moment stretched thin as wire. "Step aside," Delano said softly, "or I step through you." Kane shot first. Not to kill. Not yet. The Colt cracked and spat. Delano's hat snapped back off his skull with the force of the shot, pinning itself to the door jamb on a nail that rattled like a bell. The other two men jerked, hands going for guns. But Kane's second and third shots chewed the floorboards at their toes, wood splinters nipping their shins like angry dogs. "Next ones won't be polite," Kane said. "Leave the paper. Leave my sight." They left, angry, humiliated, promising to return with more paper and more men. The door banged. Dust settled in a slow veil. Kane replaced the spent shells with new brass, feeling the rhythm of it steady his blood. He slid the warrant under a paperweight. A cracked marble. His boy had liked the way the sunlight split in it and threw rainbows on the desk. Kane swallowed. The badge spun again, stilled. "Sheriff," came Doc's whisper from the back door. "You stir up a hornet's nest." "Was time the hornets got stirred," Kane said. "Tell me something I can use. Anything on the slug?" Doc held up a small twist of cloth. Inside lay the bullet he'd dug from Jonah Vale's ribs, flattened, dimpled, the base stamped faintly with an R. "Remington contract lot," Doc said. "Recent. Army supply headed through Red Wash. Same shipment that got stolen last month." Red Wash. Pike's men had written the report themselves. "Ambushed your own wagons, have you?" Kane thought. "Cry theft. Hang someone easy." He set the bullet beside the brass shavings and the rosette cloth strip. Old instincts, old patterns, old ghosts. Jonah Vale woke again toward noon, eyes blown wide with fever and memory. "If you're going to hang me," he rasped, "hang me clean. Don't hand me to Delano. He likes to bruise men slow." "Then talk," Kane said, drawing a chair to the bars. "Start with why you bled to my doorstep." Jonah's gaze fixed not on Kane's face, but on the badge pinned above his heart. Something like shame rippled under his sunburn. "Tried for your door, 'cause the papers say you ain't bought. Not by Pike, not by the rail men, not by nobody. That a prayer or a plan?" "A hope," Jonah said. He swallowed hard, winced, stared at his own bandages as if surprised to find them there. "I drove supply for Pike's office, easy coin. In Red Wash, Pike's boys switched lots. Good cartridges out, bad in. 2 wagons diverted to a side canyon where a private buyer waited. We were to call it stolen." He shook. I balked. They smiled. Then someone fired. Captain Drew went down. They painted my hands for it and told me to run. "Names," Kane said. Jonah's eyes grew hollow. "You won't like the biggest one." "Try me." "A man called Hollis Vane," Jonah whispered. "County judge, the one who signed your wife's estate when... Kane did not move. Not a breath. Not a blink. Inside him, something black and old uncoiled, slow as a rattler under a rock. Judge Hollis Vane, who'd read the probate like a recipe and called it healing, who'd patted Kane's shoulder in public and cut deals in private. Instants fell like beads from a broken rosary. "You certain?" he asked, voice flat. Jonah nodded. He wore a velvet collar even in the dust, carried a hand mirror, checking his hair while they loaded contraband. He shut his eyes. Pike called him Your Honor with a grin. Kane stood. The Gallows creaked in the yard, 2 streets over, an old beam complaining in the wind, the sound crawling into the conversation like a rat. Law versus justice. The scales he'd balanced till they cut grooves in his palms. He unlocked the cell. Jonah flinched. Kane held up both hands. "You're safer where I can reach you, but I need proof that outlives your breath." He reached for the man's satchel, mud-stiff, tucked under the bunk. "Any paper?" "Bottom seam," Jonah murmured, "inside the lining. Didn't dare stop to hide it better." Kane slit the seam with his pocket knife. Two things slid into his palm: a page torn from a ledger, columns of figures and initials beside wagon numbers, and something small, metallic, char-black at one edge. He turned it in his hand, half a locket. The hinge bent, the face soot-blackened, but the engraving still legible along the rim, K and E. The world tilted. Wind left the room. His wife's initials. His hand closed around the locket, hard enough to bite. A scent rose from memory. Burned wood, rain on ash, the soap she favored when nights were long and gentle. He could see the other half of the locket as it had fallen from his fingers in the ruin, swallowed by ember and night. How in God's name had this half found its way into a stranger's bag? "Where did you get this?" he asked, too calm. Jonah's lips trembled. "From a man who died on my wagon last week. He said to give it to you. Said, tell Kane I kept what mattered. He was scared he wouldn't make it. I don't even know his name." Before Kane could ask another question, hoofbeats rolled in like thunder. Many. The jailhouse windows rattled under the pressure of boots on boards. A voice Kane knew as well as his own thoughts cut the day clean. "Asa Pike," Doc whispered, face draining. "Sheriff Kane," Pike called from the street, oiled and jovial. "Open up. I've a judge with me and a pocket full of paper, and we'll be taking your prisoner now. It's the law." Kane tucked the locket into his vest, felt it warm against his heart like a coal. He slid the ledger page into the Bible under the desk, the one he read when sleep refused to come. He holstered the Colt, rolled his shoulders, breathed once. The badge spun, then stilled between thumb and forefinger. "Law ain't always justice," he murmured. Then louder, to the door. "You brought a judge, Asa? Good. I've been meaning to ask him a question." The latch turned under his hand. Outside, Pike smiled beside Judge Hollis Vane, whose velvet collar shone like sin. Behind them stood Rafe Delano and a dozen riders with papers and rope. Kane stepped into the sun and let the door ease shut behind him with a click that sounded to his ear, exactly like a clock starting to count down. The rain slackened to a mean drizzle that silvered the gallows beam at the far end of the square. Kane stood where Main Street narrowed, duster dark and dripping, the stranger's weight heavy against his shoulder. The wounded man, Jonah Vale, he'd finally rasped, shivered once and went still as Kane eased him onto the jailhouse cot. The iron smell of wet dust and old iron locks filled the air. A lantern hissed. Kane's silver badge turned lazy circles between his fingers, catching firelight, catching doubt. Boots thudded on the boardwalk outside, then a fist like a hammer on oak. Not the town's rhythm. Military. The door swung wide without the courtesy of a knock. A man in a mud-slick black coat and braided epaulettes filled the frame, hat brim shedding water in hard lines. Behind him, 4 troopers stood rigid in the rain, rifles shouldered. The man's voice was clean as a knife. "Sheriff Kane, I am Colonel Abram Holt, Acting Commander, 3rd Territorial Volunteers, Special Attachment to the Governor's Office. By order of Judge Pembroke, you will release the prisoner into my custody." Kane took him in slowly. The polished boots, the ornamental saber hilt, the waxed mustache hiding a mouth that preferred commands to conversation, authority like a cudgel. He'd known the type since the cavalry. "Prisoner's name is Jonah Vale," Kane said, voice flat. "Shot up and half dead when I found him. He talks, he breathes, he stays, for now." Holt produced a folded writ in oilskin. The seal bled red wax in the lantern's glow. Jonah Vale, charged with desertion, banditry, and the murder of 12 settlers in Las Cenizas Canyon. Writ of immediate attachment. "I'm not here to parley, Sheriff. I'm here to collect." Jonah stirred, eyes fever-glazed, and made a sound that tasted like rust. "Las Cenizas was a uniformed massacre," he managed. "Your colors, Colonel." Holt's gaze flicked once to the cot, then past it, like swatting a fly. "Men say anything with a rope in sight." Kane felt the old heat rise, rage like a coal under ash. He let his badge spin once more, the familiar weight centering his hands. "Judge Pembroke signs a lot of paper," Kane said softly. "Some of it honest, some of it bought. Paper doesn't outrank breath. Not here, not while I wear this star." Holt stepped in until their hats nearly touched, damp brims dripping. "Your county ends at that door, Sheriff. The gallows over there." He angled his chin toward the square. "Await a murderer. The governor wants quiet before the railroad men come through. I intend to give him quiet." Thunder muttered low over the flats. Somewhere, a horse shook rein from its mane. Tack jingled. Kane looked at the cot, saw the gray in Jonah's lips, the bandage he'd wrapped turning the color of bad wine. He had seen dying men perform the final miracle of speech when the right question was asked. He had also seen truth strangled with clean rope and stamped as lawful. "Appreciate your travel in this weather, Colonel," he said, voice still even. "But a man gets a night to mend and talk before you set a beam singing with him. That's my answer." Holt did not blink, then hear mine. "Sergeant." The nearest trooper's rifle shifted, wood creaking against leather. Kane's hand did not move to his Colt. He only turned his head toward the doorway. "You put a barrel in my jailhouse tonight, and you better be ready to use it on me first, and you better make that first one count." Boots whispered in haste behind Holt. Kane didn't need to look to know who it was. The smell of liniment and old whiskey told him. Deputy Riker slid in from the rain, hat clutched to his chest, eyes darting. "Sheriff, maybe we let the territory handle this one." His voice tried for casual and landed on scared. "Colonel says the governor's office is involved." Kane's steel-gray eyes cut to him. Riker flinched like a boy caught with a deck of marked cards. "You here as my deputy," Kane said, "or as the colonel's errand?" Riker swallowed. "As your friend." "Then stand on my side," Kane said, and turned back to Holt. "Judge Pembroke's writ buys you morning access after my man talks, not before." "It buys me now," Holt said. He lifted his chin toward the square. "Bring it." The troopers parted. Out of the rain shuffled 2 men with a sawhorse and a timber, a portable gallows frame, wet wood, dark as sin. The far-off hiss of rain seemed to fade. The gallows beam loomed in the lamplight just beyond the threshold. A bad dream made lumber. Holt's mouth twitched. "We can dispense with geography and do it here, if you like." A hush fell in Kane's chest, neither calm nor fear. Just the emptiness of a decision made, He stepped forward, until Holt's breath warmed his cheek with peppermint and command. "Law ain't always justice, but justice rides with me," he said. The room seemed to tilt on that sentence. It was not threat so much as bell toll. Holt's hand moved, not to the saber but to an envelope in his breast pocket. He drew it, with careful ceremony, like a preacher taking out a prayer. "I anticipated provincial stubbornness," he said, and offered the paper. Another seal, another red wax drop like a bead of blood. "By executive directive of Acting Governor Wallace, Sheriff Eli Kane is hereby suspended for obstructing territorial justice and is remanded, if necessary, into custody as an accessory after the fact. Effective immediately." Riker made a soft, choking sound. Troopers shifted. The rain grew louder, as if the sky leaned in to listen. Kane did not touch the paper. He studied Holt's eyes, looking for the thing men tried to hide when they lied. He found only satisfaction, and behind it, fear. Not of Kane, but of something Jonah's lungs might yet remember. Jonah spoke again, voice a scraped whisper. "Tell him about Paloma Ridge. Tell him about the wagons you burned to ash and called renegades. Tell him which freight company paid you to make settlers disappear." Riker took an involuntary step back. Holt's jaw tightened. "Sergeant," he snapped, "lock this door. If anyone crosses me, put them against the wall and do your duty." Kane's temper walked to the edge of the cliff and looked over. His hands stayed loose at his sides. He had buried a wife and a boy for less noble reasons than this, and learned the arithmetic of too late. "You hang him without hearing him," he said, voice gone dangerous quiet. "You'll live to wish the wind would take your name and scatter it." Holt raised his voice for the square, projecting like a hanging day preacher. "Citizens of Gray Butte, the governor's office has assumed control of a dangerous matter. Return home. The law works tonight." A door across the street cracked. Faces peered from under eaves, pale coins in rain. Kane saw the widow Cass at the boarding house door, hands gripping the frame. Old man Dupree with his scripture curled in one fist. Two ranch hands with their hats held like shields. The town watched the scales tremble. "Colonel," Kane said, keeping his eyes on the people, "you mind if justice has witnesses?" Holt smiled. Of course, a lesson even. The jailhouse felt small as a coffin. The lantern popped. Water ticked from hat brims to the floor. Kane nodded once to Jonah. "You said uniformed massacre. Names." Jonah's eyes found the ceiling as if words lived there. "Captain Silas Boone," under Holt. Orders came stamped and clean. Payment ledger reads, Paloma Ridge Freight, Granite Spur Mining, and Western Rail. Boone burned the wagons. Holt signed the story. Judge Pembroke blessed the graves. A whisper ran through the doorway crowd like a brush fire. Western Rail, Granite Spur, the holy trinity of men who owned half the territory and lent the governor his backbone. Holt's calm cracked. Not much. Just a sliver of ice showing. He turned his head enough that only Kane saw his lips thin. "This charade is over. Sergeant, shackle Sheriff Kane." The click of steel leaving leather answered him. Not from the troopers. Behind Kane. Deputy Riker's gun was out, muzzle trembling, pointed at the back of Kane's coat. Breath steamed. Rain hissed. Riker's voice broke. "I'm sorry, Sheriff. They came to me before. Said they'd forgive the debt on my land if I helped." Shame flooded his cheeks. "I can't lose the place. Sally and the girls." Kane didn't move, didn't turn. His voice softened to a place only men on the edge could hear. "You think a man keeps a roof by selling his house in pieces?" Riker's reply was a tear on wood. "They got papers with your name on 'em, too." Holt's smile returned, thin as a razor. He extended the shackles. "Your deputy is a prudent man, Sheriff. Don't make him teach your town what prudence looks like." Kane lifted his hands slowly, palms open, rainwater shining on scarred knuckles. He felt the cold mouth of the cuff close on his left wrist. The badge lay heavy against his chest. He could hear absurdly the faint tick of the jailhouse clock, a small thing measuring a big moment. Then Jonah Vale coughed hard and spat something into his palm. A bent brass button engraved with an 8-pointed star, and the letters W.R. Kane's breath caught. He knew that maker's mark. He'd seen it in the soot-rubbed imprint on a charred beam the night his own house had burned years ago. The same night he'd found nothing left of his wife and boy but ash and an old pewter spoon. Jonah croaked, eyes burning now with a fever that wasn't only sickness. "Found it on a coat at Paloma Ridge. Man who gave the order wore it like a medal. He said railroads bury problems deep." A long, low thunder rolled. Holt's hand froze an inch from Kane's right wrist. From the square, a new sound rose. The clatter of fresh riders on wet planks and the hard voice of someone who owned ink and seals. "Open in the name of the United States Circuit Court." Holt went pale under the lantern. The troopers glanced at one another, uncertainty cutting their formation like weak fence wire. Riker's pistol shook. Kane turned his head toward the door as another fist pounded it from outside. 3 quick strikes, measured, official. He closed his fingers around the open shackle on his unbound wrist and smiled without humor. "Looks like justice just rode in with its own badge," he said softly, as the door latch began to turn. The jailhouse lantern burned low, its flame dancing against the iron bars like a restless spirit. Sheriff Kane sat in the corner, his silver badge heavy in his palm, spinning slow circles between calloused fingers. Outside, thunder rolled across the plains, dragging the rain with it. The storm beat at the windows, each drop like a hammer driving in the truth he could no longer ignore. The wounded stranger lay in the back cell, breath ragged, sweat slicking his brow. He had spoken enough through fever to reveal a name Kane knew too well, Deputy Marshal Carraway, a federal authority riding with blood on his hands. Carraway's posse claimed the man was a thief, a murderer, a drifter with debts unpaid. Yet the trail of broken bodies that followed Carraway's men told another story. Kane's jaw worked as he poured a measure of whiskey into a tin cup, the scent sharp in the damp air. He offered it through the bars. The stranger's hand trembled, but he took it, sipping slow. "They'll kill me," he whispered, voice raw as gravel. "Not for what I done, but 'cause I know what they've done." Those words cut deep. Kane had carried such knowledge before. Truths the law didn't want, truths that burned hotter than any gallows rope. He heard his wife's laughter in memory, his son's small boots running across the floorboards. He remembered blood on wood, justice denied by men with badges. His hand tightened around the cup. The door crashed open. Rain spilled in on the boots of Marshal Carraway himself, flanked by 2 deputies. His coat dripped. His badge gleamed under the lantern's glow. Authority entered the room with the stench of arrogance. "Kane," Carraway said, voice smooth as a blade. "You got something of mine in that cell. Hand him over." Kane rose slow, tall shadow filling the dim light. His duster coat hung heavy with rain, his Colt .45 resting easy at his side. "That man's under my roof," Kane said, voice low but sharp. "He's got a right to a trial." Carraway's smile was thin. trial. Out here, we carry the law where the courts can't reach. I say he's guilty. That's trial enough." The deputies shifted, rifles angled, careless but ready. Kane's steel-gray eyes locked on Caraway's, unflinching. "Law ain't a noose you toss whenever it suits," he said, "and justice sure as hell ain't your pocket coin." The storm cracked outside, thunder shaking the rafters. For a breath, time held still, the badge in Kane's hand, the gun at his hip, the fevered stranger clinging to life in the cell. He could hand him over, keep the peace, let the law's false mask cover the truth. Or he could stand, as he had once failed to do, and fight for justice, knowing it might damn him forever. The choice burned in his chest. His badge caught the lantern light, spinning one last time before Kane closed his fist around it. His voice came like iron drawn from the fire. "Law ain't always justice, but justice rides with me." Caraway's smile broke. His hand dropped toward his pistol. The deputies tensed. Kane's Colt was out before the thought finished forming, steel flashing, hammer cocked. The barrel pointed at Caraway's chest, steady as the storm outside. "Nobody dies tonight unless you force it," Kane said. "That man stays till a real judge hears his word. You try to take him, you'll answer to me, badge or no badge." For a long heartbeat, nothing moved but the lantern flame. Rain hammered harder, filling the silence with a drumbeat of judgment. Caraway's deputies glanced between their marshal and the sheriff, whose eyes promised no mercy. Finally, Caraway raised his hands a fraction, mock surrender curling his lips. "You just chose your side, Kane," he said softly, menace coiled in every syllable. "The law will remember." He turned, coat snapping wet as he strode into the storm. His men followed, muttering curses. The jailhouse door slammed, rattling the frame. Inside, the stranger groaned, half-conscious. Kane holstered his Colt, his breath heavy but steady. He felt the badge's edges cut into his palm, silver warm from his grip. He slipped it back onto his chest. The storm outside had not passed. It had only begun, but Kane had made his choice. He stepped to the window, watching the shadows of Caraway's riders disappear into the sheets of rain. Lightning lit the sky, carving his scarred face in white fire. Somewhere deep, the wound of his family's loss twisted, whispering of vengeance, of ruin. But tonight, he had chosen different. Justice, not law. For once the two were not the same, and in the storm's roar, Sheriff Kane knew he would pay dearly for it. The lantern sputtered, casting long shadows across the jail walls, and Kane stood alone between the dying flame and the endless night. The latch turned. Rain hissed across the square as the door eased open, and a small figure stepped through. Hat brim streaming, coat beaded with water, a leather folio clamped under one arm, the way a soldier carries a flag. The woman's voice was clear and measured, carrying over boots and breath. "United States Circuit Court, Deputy Clerk Margaret Ellis, bearing a writ of supersedias and orders to preserve the prisoner for deposition." Colonel Holt's jaw worked. Judge Hollis Vane's velvet collar took the lantern light like sin. Pike tipped his hat with a smirk that did not touch his eyes. On the porch behind them, Rafe Delano leaned into the rain shadow and grinned around a matchstick as if a gallows were sport. Kane saw the paper before he saw the seal, thick rag stock that didn't drink ink, red wax unblurred by the storm, real, not saloon law. Miss Ellis stepped inside, shook water from her gloves, and read without flourish. The court enjoins the seizure or execution of one Jonah Vale, pending hearing at first light. Custody to remain with Sheriff Eli Kane. Colonel Abram Holt and Judge Hollis Vane are commanded to produce records pertaining to Red Wash, Paloma Ridge, and any payments to private contractors. So ordered, this day. The room held its breath. Even the lantern seemed to steady. Holt recovered first. Little far from your desk, ain't you? His smile showed no teeth. Territory's a long ride for a clerk. Law travels faster than horses, Ellis said, and looked him in the eye like she'd put a brand there. You violate this, you answer in contempt. Her gaze flicked to Riker's pistol, pressed into Kane's back. Deputy, if you arrest a sitting sheriff under a paper not signed by a federal judge, I will personally see you clapped in irons. Riker's hand trembled. Sweat mapped a path through dust on his temple. Slowly, he lowered the gun. The sound of the hammer easing down was small and indecent, like a secret folding itself away. Outside, troopers shifted. The portable gallows frame Holt had dragged to the threshold stood like a black letter in the rain. Rope swayed and clicked, a pendulum counting down to somebody's last breath. Townsfolk peered from under eaves, pale coins of faces, the widow Cass clutching a shawl, old Dupree with his scripture clamped in a blue hand. Miss Ellis raised the writ higher. This jail is now a house of the court. Hollis Vane's smile was made for funerals. And I, madam, am the court in these parts. Not tonight you aren't, Kane said. He felt the shackle on his left wrist, where Riker had closed it minutes earlier. Steel mouth cold, a ring of pressure bitten into skin. His right cuff hung open, jangling against the chain like a loose tooth. He lifted his hands and clicked the left closed with a single decisive snap, then placed the key on the desk in plain sight. See? He told them all, voice level. I ain't running, but nobody drags a dying man to a rope while I draw air. Thunder rolled. Holt's mouth thinned. Then we wait. They waited. Holt's men raised tents under the cottonwoods. Delano's riders spread along the rooftops and the hotel balcony, knives glinting as they teased damp tobacco from plugs. Vane took shelter on the boardwalk, with his velvet collar turned up, signing something in a leather book with the curious industry of a crow. The gallows beam, set forward like a threat, gleamed wet in the rain and threw a long, wet shadow across the jail's door. Inside, the stove snapped and breathed. Doc Alder bent over Jonah Vale, whose fever had climbed to a mean brightness. The wounded man's skin shone as if lit from within. Kane sponged his face, wrung the cloth, sponged again. The locket half lay in Kane's pocket, like a coal, K&E, engraved along the soot-black rim, a memory that did not cool. Talk to me, Jonah, Kane said, low, not gentle. You said a star took my boy. Vale's eyes fluttered, rolled, found him. His voice came thin and raw. Night of the fire. He swallowed. A man came wearing a badge. Said the law would keep you safe. Said to open the back door. He took Jesse to the well for air. Said the smoke'd kill him if he stayed. Jonah's smile was a broken thing. He lied. Kane's chest was wood and iron. Name. Jonah's gaze drifted to the table where Kane's badge lay, catching lamplight. He had a habit, he whispered. When he lied, he clicked his star with his thumb. Little tap. He lifted a shaking hand and made the motion in the air, a small nervous flick above the heart. Kane turned his head, slow as a door on old hinges. Deputy Riker stood under the window, watching the street through a slit between boards. Rain glittered along the edge of his badge. At some private thought, his thumb came up and, click, tapped the star. Once. The sound barely made it into the room, but it arrived like a verdict. Riker sensed the silence and looked back. Their eyes caught. The deputy's face showed nothing for a half count. Then the skin at his jaw went tight, as if a string had been drawn through it. "You weren't on the North Patrol that night," Kane said, voice quiet as falling ash. Riker's mouth opened, closed. "I done what I was told," he said, "and what I was told came signed and sealed." "By who?" Kane asked. Before the answer could be born, glass leapt. The window blew inward in a fine star of shards, and the lantern jerked and died as a bullet clanged off the iron bar, sparked, buried itself in the ledger on the desk. Flame guttered, smoked, went to a bruise-red wick. "Down!" Kane barked, tackling the Doc and Jonah both, as a second shot cracked from the hotel balcony across the square. The round punched a neat hole through the stovepipe and drew a whistling breath of smoke into the room that made eyes water. Delano. Kane knew his hand like a brand. He rolled, fired back through the broken pane, 2 measured shots to the balcony's shadow. A man cursed and scuttled. Someone else chuffed a laugh like a coyote. Outside, horses started, and the square found its noise again. Men shouting, ladies crying, the wet ratchet of rifles being racked. Miss Ellis flattened herself behind the stove with scandalized dignity, lips white, folio hugged to her ribs. "Hold your fire," Holt bellowed from the gallows. "By the governor, hold." A third shot answered him, a mean, self-employed sound from the alley by the assay office. A bullet chipped a notch from the gallows beam and set the rope swinging with obscene cheer. Kane crossed to the door, cracked it an inch. Rain sprayed his cheek like spit. "You draw another bead on this jail," he shouted toward the hotel, "and I'll teach you the difference between a bounty and a burial." The street simmered down, not to peace but to a simmer fit for meat. The hotel curtains twitched. Delano's grin shone for a heartbeat and was gone. Kane shut the door and turned. Riker hadn't moved, but his gun wasn't quite pointed at the floor anymore, and his eyes had gone old. "You let him in that night," Kane said. "You opened my door with your badge and your lie." "I got papers," Riker whispered. "I got a wife who likes bread, Sheriff. They come to a man with names and seals, and he... Kane's voice cut him. "He chooses." Riker flinched as if from a slap. He lowered the pistol at last and dragged a hand down his face, leaving streaks. "I thought they'd just take the money, scare you. I didn't know they'd..." He couldn't finish. He swallowed hard enough to hurt. "It was Pike, Asa Pike. He told me Jess would be kept till you came around. He said the judge would make it right." His eyes flicked toward the boardwalk, where Hollis Vane stood dry under an awning, velvet shining. He said, "Your Honor," like a joke. Kane's mouth didn't move. Inside, something old and black bared its teeth. Miss Ellis climbed to her feet, voice steady again by force. "Dawn," she said, "we convene at the abandoned courthouse. You," she pointed at Holt, "bring your ledgers. You," her finger slid to the judge, "bring your orders. Sheriff, bring your prisoner. No one else enters this jail." Outside, the rain wore itself down to a silver veil. The gallows beam creaked in a small, lonely way. The town exhaled, then held its breath anew. Kane sat on the bunk edge and took Jonah's hand, hot, dry, shaking. "It's almost time," he said. "You're going to tell that judge. You're going to put their names where God and the wind can't erase 'em." Jonah nodded. "Long as I keep breath." he murmured. "Long as the sun gets up. You let me carry the hard part," Kane said. He stood, holstered the Colt, checked the Winchester by the stove. He wiped rain and glass from his face and picked the badge up off the table, felt its familiar edges, the tiny nicks like a map of the last 10 years. He set it spinning on the wood, watched it blur to a ring, slow, and settle. Something thunked softly against the wall behind Jonah's cell. Kane turned. A cylinder no longer than a man's hand popped through the broken pane and clattered under the bunk. It was wrapped in red-waxed paper. A fuse hissed bright blue, spitting like a bad-tempered snake. "Dynamite," Doc Alder said, voice suddenly very small. The world thinned to that sound, the spit and whisper of the fuse, the hiss of rain, the far rattle of tack. Kane's boots were moving before thought knew the shape of the act. He lunged, grabbed the sizzling length, and for an instant felt its coarse paper bite his palm, and the heat of its little blue tongue licking closer. He hurled it at the window. It struck the iron bar and bounced, once, twice, then rolled back beneath Jonah's bunk, where woolen shadow welcomed it like a friend. Time narrowed to the glow at the fuse's tip. Kane reached down again, fingers closing on light, and the door latch behind him moved, slow as a snake, as someone outside began to open the jail. The fuse hissed like a snake that had learned to count. Blue spit chewed fast toward the red paper belly under Jonah's bunk. The latch turned. The door eased an inch. Rain hissed through the gap. Kane moved before thought had a name. He dropped to one knee, boots skidding on glass, and snatched the burning cord with 2 fingers. Heat bit skin. He yanked. Nothing. Spike fuse. Crimped. No pulling it clean. The door began to open. "Hold!" Kane snarled. A wet coat hit the floor beside him. Ms. Ellis, hat askew, dove across the room without dignity, slapping the coat over the fuse with both palms. Deputy Riker slammed his body into the door, teeth bared, forcing it shut against whoever pushed from outside. Wood groaned. The coat smoked. The hiss softened, then went strangled and silent. A rifle cracked from the hotel balcony. The lantern burst. Darkness gulped the jailhouse. Splinters chased the shot across the room. The stovepipe rang like a bell. Kane rolled and fired twice through the broken pane, muzzle flame stuttering at the rain. A shape cursed and fell back. Outside, Holt's voice rose like a judge reading a warrant. "Stand down. By the governor. Stand down." What stood down was the rain. It slackened to a wet whisper. Kane's heart beat slow again, each thud a count of who still breathed. Doc Alder wheezed behind the stove. Ms. Ellis crouched with the fouled coat, smoking under her hands, jaw clenched. Riker leaned on the door, forehead against the plank, gun loose at his side, shame a sheen on his skin. "Get me light," Kane said. He found the water pail by memory and flung it across the coat. Steam puffed. The room took a first breath. Under the bunk, the dynamite lay sullen and blackened, fuse bitten to a cough. "Polite visitor," Ms. Ellis murmured, voice steadying. "Brings his own fireworks." Kane looked at Riker and saw a man who had walked to the cliff's edge and finally looked down. "You want to live with what you've done?" Kane asked quietly. Riker nodded without finding words. "Then earn it at dawn." Dawn seeped into Grey Butte like a secret too heavy to carry. The abandoned courthouse, a long dead temple of weathered oak and dust-filmed windows, took the gray first, drank it, and made it honest. The Gallows beam 2 streets over creaked at a distant gust. The square was a circle of wet hats and white faces. Miss Ellis planted the circuit court seal like a nail in the courthouse lectern and read, voice clean, "Hearing to preserve testimony in Re Jonah Vale. Orders for records from Redwash, Paloma Ridge, and payments to private contractors. Custody, Sheriff Eli Kane." Colonel Holt stood stiff with frost in his mustache. Judge Hollis Vane wore a velvet collar that shone like sin even in morning light. Asa Pike smiled as if the world were his idea. Rafe Delano leaned in the back with a match unlit between his teeth. Kane brought Jonah in his arms because the stretcher would have shamed him. Vale's breath rasped, fever brightening his eyes to glass. Doc Alder settled him at the witness table and tied off the bandage anew, hands brisk, mouth a hard line. "Mr. Vale," Ms. Ellis said, "you are under oath." Jonah wet cracked lips. "They stole army stores," he said. "Swapped lots at Redwash. Boone burned the wagons at Paloma Ridge. Colonel Holt signed the story. Judge Vane blessed it with paper. Pike sold to private hands. Delano did the dirty in the dark." Holt's jaw clicked. Vane's smile did not change. "Wild fever talk," the judge said lightly. "This dying man slanders public servants in their duty. Dying men don't waste breath on fiction," Kane said. His silver badge spun once and stilled between thumb and forefinger. "Names paid?" Ms. Ellis pressed. Jonah nodded to Kane. "Ledger," he whispered. Kane pulled the page from the Bible he'd tucked under his coat. Columns, figures, initials. He laid it on the table, the paper catching the new light like a fish takes sun. Ms. Ellis bent close, pen scratching. A shot split the courthouse air like a whip. Jonah jerked, as if yanked by wire. Blood bloomed high on his shoulder, then ran hot down his chest in a sheet. The window glass above the door trembled and rained grit. Rafe Delano had lost the match from his mouth. Smoke trailed the barrel of a rifle in the shadows of the hotel balcony across the square. Kane was already in motion. He dragged Jonah from the witness table in one violent sweep, knocked the lamp aside, and took the wounded man against his chest. Jonah's blood came hot and full, soaking Kane's shirt, then finding the locket in his vest pocket and painting it dark. "Hold pressure," Doc Alder barked, shoving a wad of cloth into Kane's free hand. Kane clamped down. The cloth slipped. The locket slipped with it. Blood slicked the soot-blackened face and found the hinge. Something soft hissed, the same way the fuse had hissed, and the outer plate, long clotted with smoke from a house fire years gone, gave up its filth. Underneath, brass gleamed. Tiny letters etched there woke in the light, like a thing that had slept too long. "For my daughter, Elise, H.V." The world narrowed to those strokes. Elise, his wife's true name, the one he barely spoke, cut with care by a jeweler's hand. H.V., not a prayer, not a stranger's mark. Hollis Vane. Kane's eyes lifted from the locket to the judge's throat. Velvet collar. Gold chain. A small half-moon glinting where the chain dipped beneath. A second locket half, its edge set with the same tiny bead pattern, hiding like a coin in a cardman's fingers. Jonah coughed. Crimson flecked his lips. His hand shot up with sudden ferocity and snagged the chain at Vane's neck as the judge leaned in to scold Miss Ellis for permitting disorder. The chain snapped with a sound like a tiny bone breaking. The locket half skittered across the floor and came to rest by Kane's boot. For a breath, the courthouse forgot to murmur. Kane set his half beside the fallen piece. The two edges kissed, clicked, and became whole. Inside, under glass, a miniature daguerreotype, no bigger than a silver dollar, looked up at him. Elise on a sun porch, hair caught by wind. Infant Jessie bawling in her arms, and Judge Hollis Vane in the background, hat off, his hand on Eliza's shoulder, his eyes on the camera with a pride too naked to hide. Blood revealed everything the rain had tried to wash away. "Your Honor," Miss Ellis said, voice gone flat in a way that could cut rope. "Kindly explain why your initials are in the sheriff's wife's locket." Van's smile trembled, then rebuilt itself. "Family acquaintances," he said. "Charity, a godfather's remembrance. Gods don't sign with their surnames," Kane said. Delano's second shot shattered the lectern. The room exploded into motion, troopers dragging tables, townsfolk ducking, Holt shouting orders that sounded like panic wearing a uniform. Asa Pike drew and moved like a snake through grass, eyes on Jonah Vale, murder built into his next breath. Riker moved, too. He stepped between Pike and Jonah, both hands shaking, pistol rising not to Kane, but past him. "No more," he said to Pike, voice raw. "I ain't your door boy no more." Pike's first shot hit Riker square under the ribs. Riker's pistol fired as he fell. The bullet tore Pike's hat and carved a hot line along his scalp. Blood ran into Pike's grin. He smiled wider and took aim again, only to have Miss Ellis slam the heavy writ book across his wrist. With surprising fury, the shot went wild and chewed a chunk of the judge's velvet. Kane came up, Colt in his hand, and put a round into the Hotel Eve where Delano's smoke curled. The bounty man dropped his rifle and vanished. Doc Alder had both hands inside Jonah's wound now, elbows red. "He needs a quiet minute, or the only judge he gets is the one upstairs," he grunted. Riker lay half-turned on the courthouse floorboards, breath bubbling, eyes fixed on Kane like a child begging forgiveness, and a man denying himself none. He reached with a wet hand and got as far as the blood-shined locket. His fingers smeared a red streak across the miniature's glass, then drifted to the plank beside it. He drew letters with what life he had left, JESS. His hand fell. He forced it up again, shaking. The next stroke wobbled, crooked, then steadied to an A. "Alive," he rasped, barely sound at all. "Jessie, ain't dead, Sheriff. Pike." A muzzle flashed. Riker's head snapped sideways. The rest of the word never came. Kane pivoted on the shot. Rafe Delano had crawled back to the jailhouse roofline and found himself a pistol. Smoke still curled from it like a sneer. Delano saw Kane see him and ran for the far ladder, hatless now, scalp bleeding. Colonel Holt, white about the lips, drew on Kane. "Stand down," he shouted. "Drop that iron." Kane's badge spun once between his fingers and flashed. He felt the weight of the joined locket in his palm, cold and hot at once. Judge Vane was retreating, mouth opening to issue a paper shield that might save a neck. Asa Pike, blood on his cheek, was smiling at the floor where Riker's half-written truth bled toward the cracks. Jonah Vale's breath scraped like a broken fiddle string. Miss Ellis's hand hovered near the seal as if it were a weapon. "Law ain't always justice," Kane said, the words low and edged. "But justice rides with me." He lifted the Colt and sighted, not on Holt, not on Vane, but on the chain Pike wore tucked inside his vest, the one that had glinted at the well the night of the fire, in a memory he hadn't trusted until this second. He squeezed. The shot cut the chain, and something small and silver dropped into Pike's palm. A child's ring on a leather thong. The ring Jesse had worn on a ribbon to keep him from losing it when he chased dogs in the yard. Pike closed his fingers around it like a gambler hiding an ace and laughed. "You want the boy, Sheriff?" he said softly, blood streaking his smile. "Then come earn him." Boots thundered on the porch. A fresh squad of riders poured into the square, badges catching dawn. Not Holt's men, not Delano's. A U.S. Marshal with rain in his beard and a grim set to his jaw stepped to the threshold with 6 deputies fanned behind. "In the name of the United States," he barked, "everyone drop iron." Guns lifted and froze, barrels aimed at too many hearts. Kane didn't lower his, because his dead wife's locket lay whole in his hand, because his deputy had written a child's name in his own blood, because Asa Pike was smiling with Jesse's ring in his fist, and because the last thing the morning gave him was a sound he hadn't heard in 8 years, thin, high, and impossible, from somewhere out in the waking street. A boy's voice, cracked with fear and hope, calling through rain and clamor, "Pa." The square went silent as a church without a choir. Kane turned toward the doorway, gun in one hand, locket in the other, and felt the ground tilt under his boots as if the world itself had stepped into a gallop. Kane stood between 2 scaffolds, the gallows with its honest rope, and the invisible one he'd tied himself to the day Elise and Jesse vanished in fire and smoke. He had worn the badge to keep balance, telling himself the law was a bridge between grief and right. But the morning had set proof and blood on the table. It said the law could be bought by velvet collars and soldiers' ink. It said justice sometimes hid inside a locket until heat and time stripped the lie from its face. He thought of Riker's shaking hand, of Miss Ellis raising paper like a shield, of Jonah's breath fighting uphill to carry names the law wished buried. He could feel the joined locket heavy against his heart. He could feel the old weight of the Colt in his palm. He had spoken the words he feared. Law ain't always justice. Now a voice had called him Pa through rain and rifles. If Jesse lived, then mercy and fury would have to ride the same horse, and he would have to choose each mile whether to be savior or executioner. The badge had never been more than a coin. Which side it showed when it fell would become his legacy. He tucked the locket away and lifted his eyes to meet the day.